Thanks very much. It's nice to be here. I was here a couple years ago for a conference about global warming, and I had a very nice time. It was a good conference, and so it's nice to come back. I've been involved in trying to do something about environmental problems for a long time now. I'm surprised to think how long it is, 20 years or more. And the question that we have to begin to ask ourselves now is, once we agree that we really want to do something about an environmental problem, what do we really do about solving it? The environmental issues were very different in the 1960s when everybody discovered the environment. That was a decade of confrontation where it was necessary to assert that environmental issues were important issues. And so there was a reason to have a confrontation and just say they were important. But things have really changed. There was a survey last summer by a Washington-based organization that showed that about 80% of the people in the United States listed the environment among the top 4 issues, said that they would take a cut in their standard of living for a better environment, and also said that they believed a good environment would lead to an improved economic situation. So that's a very different set of ideas than in the 1960s. What we see now is that people generally agree, at least rhetorically, that the environment is a good thing. We want a good environment. It's hard to find a politician who won't claim he's an environmentalist now. So this means that those of us who are really interested in the environment are stuck with having to now really solve the problems now that people say they want them solved. And this is a lot tougher than I think we've imagined. And one of the main points I want to make tonight is that it's my experience that when we try to solve environmental issues, we say things and believe things that we think are based on scientific principles, but in fact these are often based on ancient myths that you can trace back to the Greeks and Romans, and that these interfere with our solutions to environmental problems rather than help us. And so we have to be very hard-nosed and rational and look at what the real condition and characteristics of the environment is with and without people's influence, so that we can understand what the environment is like, what nature's like, and then we can begin to do something. Now, I want to mainly talk through slides and illustrate these points. So if we can begin. I don't know if, I guess I can't control anything here, is that right? That's a good metaphor for what I was just saying, that we can't control everything. The basic problem that I think we have is in this cartoon from the New Yorker, where there's this couple standing in what is obviously Noah's Ark line, and the wife is saying, maybe you should go make sure we're in the right line. I think New Yorker probably thought they were waiting to get into Disneyland. But what this represents is that we don't understand anymore what our place is in nature, where we fit in. We have a set of myths about our possible role in nature, but we no longer feel comfortable with where we belong. We think we have messed everything up, but we don't really know where we should be. You go on to the next slide. The usual approach to the idea of what the environment ought to be like is the notion that nature undisturbed by people is like one of the classic 19th century Hudson River School paintings. Actually, this is called Twilight in Yosemite. It's a little far from the Hudson River, but it's that style of painting. This is an image of nature as perfectly peaceful, tranquil, highly structurally ordered and beautiful, and you notice there's no person in the picture. So we have this idea about nature that left alone it achieves a perfect, constant condition, and that's a good condition, that's the right condition. And it's a condition without people. Now, this is very current in my own state of California. I was just talking to somebody in the nursery business, tree nurseries, and they said that the planners in the city of Los Angeles are now saying that all trees are unnatural in the city of Los Angeles and they should be removed because they're using water, and Los Angeles should go back to being the semi-desert that it was at the time of Spanish exploration. This is policymakers within the government of the city of Los Angeles, and they are operating under the statement that I've just made to you, that nature without human influence was the right condition, and whatever we do must be wrong. So, and there's lots of other examples of current issues. Go on, if I could have the next slide. Another kind of notion that we have about the environment, about nature, is illustrated by this painting by Rousseau in the 19th century. And this is titled "The Indian Fighting the Gorilla in the Jungle." Of course, the gorillas are old world, and the Indian is an American Indian. So we also confuse our ideas and mix things up together. We'll go on to the next. I want to tell you the story of a case very much like the situation I think we're in this decade, where we want to do something that's right for the environment and are not sure what to do. I want to tell you the story of the attempt to manage Tsavo National Park. That's a very large national park in Kenya. This is a park that's, I believe it's 8,000 square miles larger than the state of Connecticut. It first became a park in the 1950s, and the first person to be made the ranger, the head of it, was a man named David Sheldrick, and he was a conservationist. And he went down to Tsavo, which is south of Nairobi, in very dry country, and he looked it over, and it's in dry, flat terrain, and he decided that it didn't have any scenic qualities of its own that would make it into an attractive place for tourists, but it had a lot of wildlife, and that his goal was to make it into a very good place to see wildlife. It had a good abundance of elephants. And so the first thing he did was to try to get rid of the elephant poaching, and he mounted a kind of anti-guerrilla warfare against the poachers with jeeps and machine guns and so forth. And he also dammed the major river and dug artesian wells to try to provide year-round water for the elephants. Now, his actions were very successful, and by the early 1960s, there was a buildup in the elephant population, and there was a concern that there were too many elephants. This became an international issue, and the Ford Foundation decided to sponsor a study and brought in one of the world's experts on elephants named Richard Laws, who was doing a study in Uganda. And Richard Laws came in and said that there were too many elephants in Tsavo, and that 3,000 elephants should be shot in order to keep the population within the carrying capacity of the park. Now, Sheldrick, the warden, at first went along with this idea, but then backed off from it. After all this happened and Sheldrick died, his wife wrote a book called The Tsavo Story, which was basically an apology for what happened. And she said that Sheldrick decided that the proper policy for management at Tsavo was to let nature seek its own course, that left alone, nature would achieve the right abundance of the elephants, and that abundance would persist indefinitely, and that it was only the arrogance of people who believed that they could interfere in a positive way. So now this was not this is a situation where you had two very different views about conservation and doing something for the environment. It was not a confrontation between pro and anti-environmentalists. It was an argument between two points of view between people, both of whom had the same goal, which was to maintain this park with its wildlife in perpetuity for people to enjoy. Laws, actually, who I know and have talked this over with, said that it was a very uncomfortable situation to the point that he felt personally threatened and his goods personally threatened. He left his materials with the Canadian embassy and left Kenya. So, I mean, it was not a gentlemanly argument. In 1969 and 70, there was a major, I could have the next slide, there was a major drought, and 6,000 elephants died. This is a picture of the border of the park. 6,000 elephants died. And as they died not of lack of water themselves, but they died of lack of food because the vegetation didn't grow. So as they died, they destroyed the vegetation. And so the view you see here is a picture I took in 1977, so just about 10 years after the drought. And the park is on the left. And this is the border. And then on the right is outside the park. So it's a mirror image of what you would expect. You expect the park to be the green island in the midst of a destroyed landscape. This was the opposite. There wasn't a fence to keep the elephants out. There was a road, a rear road, and 2 fire breaks, and the elephants don't like to cross that amount of human activity. We did a study of elephants, and we wanted to put an exclosure up to have plants grow that the elephants couldn't get at. And I went to the Chain Link Company, and I asked them what kind of fence to put up. And they said, get the cheapest fence. If an elephant wants to knock a fence down, it's going to knock it down. It doesn't matter. So the elephants were not prevented from this, but behaviorally they wouldn't cross it. So the idea of leaving the park alone and letting nature take its course failed in this case. Now, shortly after the Sheldrick, not shortly after, but by 1977, Sheldrick did have a heart attack and died, and the people that knew him felt that it was sort of dying of a broken heart over this incident. So this really did affect people. It had a major impact on Tsavo, which today has undergone some recovery. But if I could have the next slide, we flew over the park for, the other thing I wanted to point out is that you can see the effects of that destruction from, this is a Landsat satellite image, and this is the border of the park right here, and this is false infrared, so the red means lots of vegetation, and the brown is the soil showing through without any vegetation. So from 144 miles above the Earth's surface, you can see the combined effects of climate, people, and elephants. If we go on to the next slide, we flew over this for 6 hours and saw maybe 20 animals, which is very unusual, so few in this area. That's what Tsavo looked like 10 years after the incident. So the notion that we can maintain the environment by not doing anything, at least in this case, didn't work. And the belief that nature would be achieve a constant single condition that would maintain itself indefinitely, that didn't work. So there's something wrong with that attitude, that belief, although, as I said, it's still prevalent not only in the statements of policymakers in California, but actually in some of our laws. I can go on to the next. Another example I want to tell you about that connects the myths very directly, the ancient myths very directly, has to do with mule deer. We can go to the next slide. On the Kaibab Plateau. The Kaibab Plateau is the north rim of the Grand Canyon. So this is standing where most people stand on the south rim of the Grand Canyon Village and then looking to the Kaibab Plateau. You can ask about the elephants in Tsavo, why would there be such a deep-seated belief in the idea of letting nature take its course when Tsavo itself is such a clear example that attitude, at least there, that belief didn't work. And that's what question I asked myself in the middle 70s when I kept coming across examples like Tsavo, but in widely different fields, everything from conservation of whales to elephants and everything from EPA to endangered species. Why did I keep finding these beliefs and attitudes stated by scientists and by policymakers when they seem to be not connected correctly to the facts? Now, there was a famous history of the mule deer on the Kaibab, which, go on to the next slide, has to do with the role of mountain lions. Now, this is a story that is told by Aldo Leopold, who of course is famous as having played a very important role in conservation in the United States. It's very familiar to you all here, I'm sure. And let's go on to the next slide. Leopold said that there had been the same kind of thing I just described to you about the elephants at Tsavo. He said that there had been a massive increase in the mule deer on the Kaibab and then a tremendous die-off. And he said that the reason for the failure of the deer population, the crash of the deer population, was the hunting of the predator of the mule deer, the mountain lion. He said that the role of the mountain lion was to maintain the abundance of its prey, the mule deer, and the two of them together would function without human interference to maintain a proper abundance of both. Now, the evidence that he used this is his graph of what he says happened. He said that there was a low number of deer around 1905, and then a buildup until a peak was reached of about 100,000 around the mid-1920s. And then the deer population crashed about the same time the stock market crashed in 1929. And you see, he points out that 30,000 would probably have been a good number, a number that could have been sustained for a long period. Now, it turns out, if we can go on to the next slide, that Leopold's statement about this was based on a report by another wildlife person whose name was Rasmussen. And this was the graph that was actually in Rasmussen's report, and it contained estimates from 3 different sources. This was a time at which no one actually made very accurate counts of the abundance of mule deer. Another thing we find out about environmental issues is that although everybody wants to establish policy and solve the problems, very few people ever want to get the information, and governments don't want to pay to have the information necessary to make good policy. So this was true at the early part of the century as well. But anyway, all these estimates are very rough estimates, but there were 3 estimates. There was one, the dotted line, which follows the story that Leopold told. So then there were 2 others. There was one that you really couldn't tell whether there was any increase at all in the population, and another set of estimates that suggested that the population got up to around 30,000, which is what Leopold said would have been the right number that could have sustained itself. So when you look at the evidence available, it turns out that the total evidence that was available doesn't let you say that there was or was not an increase in the mule deer. Not only that, but there is even less evidence that the mountain lion played a significant role in maintaining the mule deer population. There were other possible causes. For example, around the turn of the century, there had been many cattle and sheep grazed on the Kaibab, and it didn't work out very well, so they were moved out. There had been as many as 100,000 cattle and sheep. And so another possible argument about why there would be a buildup in deer at the turn of the century was that the cattle and sheep had been removed, and although deer are browsers, that there was enough competition so that this would have provided more food for the deer. Another thing that happened was a change in fire frequency, and there were some fires around the beginning of the century that opened up the vegetation and provided more food for the deer. So there were 3 possible explanations. So here we are, and if we go on to the next slide, this is the graph about the Kaibab story taken from a textbook. And so Leopold's story is repeated in textbooks as the truth about the Kaibab. And when you actually go back and reconstruct it, which this reconstruction was done by Graham Cawley, an Australian biologist, it turns out that, first of all, you don't know, the evidence doesn't allow you to say there ever was an explosion and crash in the mule deer on the Kaibab. And second, even if there was, we have 3 possible explanations, none of which, and we can't necessarily attach any more importance to the mountain lion. So why did such a good conservationist as Aldo Leopold attach the importance to the mountain lion, and why did this get promulgated into the future? Well, a person who's a philosopher about the environment who has studied Leopold's career, Baird Collicott from the University of Wisconsin, said that actually in Leopold's career he was at first responsible for promoting predator control. And he had a lot to do with the shooting of coyotes and mountain lions and wolves. And then he met a famous British ecologist named Charles Elton. And Elton told him about the modern thinking in ecology and told him about the idea of the role of predators. And Leopold went through a personal catharsis and completely changed his point of view. Now, where does the idea come that mammalian predators are important for controlling the abundance of their prey? It turns out that there's very little substantial data in the scientific literature to back that up. However, if you go back into history, you find that Jefferson says the same thing, that 18th century theologians, in a very important book discussing the discoveries in the New World after the Age of Exploration and trying to deal with the philosophical question, why are there predators on the earth, you find the same explanation. There's a book by Count de Buffon, a European theologian, and he asked the question, why are there on the earth what he calls vicious and venomous creatures? And he uses as an example the South American condor, which he said not only takes sheep but small children. And he said that God made a perfect world, and in his wisdom made the benign and beneficent creatures like sheep and deer able to multiply quickly, and they were unable to control their own abundance. And then he made the predators who are not able to reproduce rapidly, he made them so that they would control the abundance of the prey. And actually, Count de Buffon was merely quoting the Greek and Roman idea, which is the idea of the balance of nature. So when you read Cicero, who summarizes those ideas, you find the same statement. And this goes back to the classic idea of the balance of nature, which has 2 components. One goes back to the cartoon I showed you at the beginning of the great chain of being, every creature in its place, a place for every creature and every creature in its place. And also the idea that if the world was made by a perfect being, it must be structurally perfect, and therefore any change in it must be bad. Its natural condition must be perfect. If there's a place for every creature, there must be a perfect role for every creature, and there must be a purpose for predators. Explaining why there were predators and venomous creatures was the hardest thing to explain, as the worst case if you're looking for structural perfection in the world. So what I'm saying is that we have a 2,000 and longer year cultural heritage of what is the role of predators. And in the 20th century, without more evidence, this statement has become treated as if it were based on scientific information, and it isn't. It's still a myth about how nature operates. Now, the next slide. So this is Saint Jerome in the wilderness. There are in the history of in the West 3 main ideas about what the environment is like, what nature is like. One is the divine order, which I've just talked about, and I'll mention the 2 others as I go along. Next slide. The second one is the machine idea. Now, with the rise of the new science and engineering in the 18th and 19th century, there was a lot of fundamental changes in people's ideas. There was a book written in the 20th century called Mountain Gloom and Mountain Glory, which talked about the changes in people's ideas about nature. Before the rise of new science and the machine age, people actually believed the earth was either like a fellow creature or was alive. We explain how things work by analogy. So if you want to explain how the earth works, you explain it by what you know. And the pre-scientific age explanation was in terms of the human body. That's what people knew. So the pre-scientific explanations about how the world worked were very biological as well. There was another third myth, the Mother Nature idea that the earth was alive and like a fellow creature. As an example of that, the first person to go down into an active volcano and return and write about it was a Jesuit priest named Father Kircher, who did this in the 17th century. And when he came back up, he went down in Mount Etna and Mount Vesuvius, and he saw the explosions and fires. Instead of talking about force and power and geological processes, he quoted from Virgil, and he talked about how what was the food of the volcano, and other people of that era talked about the rivers of the earth being the earth's veins, and undersea upward moving waters being the arteries. See, so they had this very biological set of explanations. With the beginning of the machine age, there was a change in people's way of looking at the environment. They began to explain the earth in terms of machinery. And so here's a painting in the 20th century by a man named Sheeler, and it's a painting of a hydroelectric power generator. And so it's treating that mechanical object as an art object. And that's to make the point that we began to see machines as a metaphor. Ecology as a science, which is the science that deals with much of environmental issues, I find it provides a foundation for much of the environmental sciences and for dealing with environmental issues, started in the 19th century, and its theories are borrowed directly from the theories in physics and mechanics, and the mathematics of much ecological theory is directly from Newton's calculus for machines. And so there's another whole set of ideas about the earth as a machine. I'll come back to this later, but it's interesting that when you this notion of the earth as a machine reinforced the divine order idea, because it leads to the notion that, first of all, a machine can have a fixed, perfect maximum power output. And so the calculations for harvesting fish and wildlife and forest were based on calculations for machinery for essentially a maximum power output. And go on to the next slide. And so from this mechanical machine age notion, you get this very nice growth curve, the way a population was supposed to grow undisturbed. This is what the elephants were supposed to do in Tsavo, was to grow following that S-shaped curve up to a fixed carrying capacity. And the mathematics behind that is the mathematics of Newton from a machine, and it treats nature as a machine. So individuals have no personality, no individuality. They're just like little gears in a big machine. Okay, now go on to the next slide. The machine age idea about nature not only reinforced, on the one hand, the divine order notion of the perfection of nature. It also led to the other notion, if you start building machines and you don't like one and you improve on it, you throw the other one out. So that's the other side of the coin about the machine age notion, is that if you don't like nature the way it is, you can just throw it out and put in your own idea of nature. And so that leads to a very strongly manipulative point of view. This is a 19th century American painting called American Progress. And this represents the other side of the coin. You can see this lady is carrying a book, and you can't see here, but it's the Book of Knowledge. And you can see in her hand is the telephone, the telegraph wire. And before her is the darkness of the Indians and the buffalo, and behind is the lightness of industry and trains. So, see, these paintings reveal how deep and prevalent these attitudes are. When we approach these things as scientists or as a people trying to make policy, I think we're not aware of how deep-seated and how dependent these ideas are and how much we depend on them. We can go on to the next slide. So now we have to begin to ask, what is nature really like? What are the true characteristics of natural ecological systems with and without human influence? So I'll tell you another story. This is about a nature preserve called Hutchison Memorial Forest. And I was the caretaker of this forest when I was a graduate student. It was the last remaining uncut stand of woodland on the New Jersey Piedmont. It was the original oak hickory had been chestnut forest. And this stand, which was quite small, 65 acres, it was a woodlot owned by a Dutch settler family named the Metlers, who bought the land in 1701 and kept very careful family records, and they never cut this woodlot. And by the 1950s, it was the last remaining stand, and Rutgers arranged to purchase it from the family and make it to a preserve. Now, this became a media event, made the cover of Time magazine, and there was an article in Audubon magazine that said that here was a place where nature would achieve a constant condition that would be of benefit to all the creatures that lived in it. It was another restatement of this divine order idea. Sinclair Oil, which provided some of the money to purchase it, had a national advertising campaign that showed pictures of this wood and quoted the people studying it as saying that this was a natural ecological community of living things which would achieve a constancy that would remain indefinitely. So again, in the 1950s, this was the notion of what this preserve would be. We go on to the next slide. This was the picture inside Life magazine. So it was a very Disney-esque view of nature, all the creatures very happy, all mingling together. Okay, we go on to the next slide. Actually, it's quite an attractive woodland, and this is the way it looked in the late 1960s. It was mainly oak in the canopy, the main trees, the mature trees, but there was no oak regeneration. In the 65 acres, we found about 2 oak saplings. All the regeneration, go on to the next slide, was in maples. Tree regeneration was maples, either Norway maples, which are of course introduced, or sugar maples. It turns out that this forest had actually been heavily altered by people in the past. In 1749, a Swedish botanist named Peter Kalm, sent over by Linnaeus to collect plants to send back to Europe, traveled from Philadelphia to Montreal, and he passed through this area, through New Brunswick, New Jersey, right through these woodlands. And he said that the woods were full of large trees, and the ground was so open between the trees that you could drive a horse and carriage through the woods without any problem. Now you can see this is the way the woods looked in 20 years ago, and you can see it's a thicket of small stems. Now, the difference in composition of the species on of the regenerating plants and in the density of the understory has to do with fire. studies of the woods showed that fires had gone through this area about every 10 years prior to 1701. Now you can reconstruct the history of fires by looking at tree cross-sections of the trees that are cut down in studies. And if a tree is burned by a fire so that the fire burns through the outer bark, through the bark, then a scar is left. And since you can count the growth rings after the fire scar, you can get the average time between fires. And that worked out to every 10 years. And no fires occurred after 1701. Now, the explorers of early America report many fires in this area, and all of them say that these were lit by the Indians for one reason or another. So the magnificent woodland that everyone appreciated and thought of as natural was actually the product of a certain kind of human intervention. Now, it took 200 years for the removal of that intervention to express itself. It took 200 years for the lack of fire to favor sugar maple. Sugar maple is not as resistant to fire as the oak, so removing the fire slowly favored sugar maple. Well, trees have their own pace of doing things compared to people, so it took a long time. But actually this forest is going to go to a forest of sugar maple and then aliens, Norway maple. It will become a forest that no one ever saw, and it won't be constant, it'll be very changeable. So this posed a dilemma. If this was a nature preserve, but it was supposed to preserve oaks and hickories, what should you do? Should you leave it alone, or should you burn it, or what? And you see, there's a trap in this mythology because it puts you into impossibly contradictory positions. Out of this, you get the idea that, first of all, things that we have valued aesthetically and thought of as natural are sometimes quite heavily influenced by human beings. My colleague Lee Talbot, who is one of the experts on wildlife in the Serengeti and did some of the early studies there, believes that the Serengeti plains, the high density of animals in the Serengeti is primarily the result of frequent fire, and that those fires are primarily lit by people and have been for thousands of years, because when lightning strikes occur, it's often too wet for natural fires. And the high abundance that we admire in the Serengeti as natural may also be the product of human intervention. So that's one thing we begin to find out, that some of the scenery we like is really the product of human effects on the landscape. And second, that the landscape is very dynamic. Now that's the next slide. Let's see, I think I'll go past these because the time is getting a little short. So could you go past, I want to get to a picture of a bird. This is just evidence about the history of, let's just keep going. Okay, go on to the next slide. Okay, now the next point I want to make is that not only are natural systems variable and changing as this forest is undergoing changes if we leave it alone, but that rather than natural systems being constant, changes of certain kinds are an integral part of natural systems, and organisms have evolved and adapted to these changes and therefore often require them. A very good case in point is the case of the Kirtland's warbler, which is this small bird. Now this is an endangered species, and the Kirtland warbler was the first songbird ever subject to a complete census in the 1950s. So it was the first songbird ever having its whole population counted. And so an annual census was started, and they discovered that the numbers of the warbler, the number was dropping very rapidly, so that by the early 60s there were only half as many of them. Now the Kirtland warbler has a very specific set of requirements. You can go on to the next slide. The warbler nests only in one kind of woodland called jack pine woods, and this is a picture of a jack pine stand in a natural area. The jack pine only comes in after fire. Jack pine has cones that are called serotinous. They have a glue that only, the scales on the cones only the glue is only released after the cones are heated by a fire. And then the glue is released, and then the first rain after a fire warps the scales open and the seeds fall out at just the right time for germination. Also, if you look at the stand of jack pine, you see a mature jack pine, but if you look straight at eye level, there are no little jack pine. Jack pine is very intolerant of shade, and it can't grow under the shade of any other tree. So jack pine can't germinate without a fire, and even if you planted it, it wouldn't grow in the shade of any other tree. So jack pine requires fire. The reason ornithologists realized in the early 1960s that the Kirtland's warbler was disappearing is that it would only nest in jack pine woodlands, and the jack pine woodlands were disappearing from Michigan, where the bird nested, because of the policy of suppressing fires. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Audubon Society, and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources got together and worked out a management plan. And beginning in the mid-1970s, 38,000 acres were set aside, and sections of them are burned every year so that there are young jack pine stands to maintain the habitat for the warbler. Okay, so that's a very different attitude. In the 1920s, there was an article in Audubon magazine that said fire is the worst enemy of the Kirtland's warbler. In the 1964, there was an article in the Audubon magazine that said, titled "A Bird Worth a Forest Fire." So there was a complete change in attitude. Out of this story, we recognize that changes of certain kinds are natural and desirable for conservation. Now, this leads to a very different perspective on managing the environment, and it's the perspective that some changes are desirable for conservation and for a good environment, and that some actions by people in the past have actually led to an environment that we think is more pleasing. Now, when I wrote this in my book, Discordant Harmonies, I said repeatedly that making these statements will alarm some people because it seems to open a Pandora's box of admitting change. And the question arises, if you admit that one kind of change is natural, how can you oppose any change? And after the book came out and I was interviewed by someone from the New York Times, I got a call from someone working for the National Marine Fisheries Service, and they said, "We've been talking about that article and we're all concerned about it because what happens, we're concerned that if you admit that one kind of change is natural, how can we talk about criticizing any kind of change?" So that concern actually came back to me directly from scientists working in the National Marine Fisheries Service. The answer to that is, I think it's the opposite of what you think, or tend to think. As long as you believe no change is natural, then you have no metric to judge what's a good change and a bad change. Once you admit that and understand and recognize that some changes are natural, then you can ask what are natural changes. And it turns out that there are some kinds of changes that are natural and some rates of changes that are natural. They're natural in the sense that they've been in the environment of living things for long enough for living things to have evolved and adjusted to them. And so that becomes your measure. You can say that if our effects on the environment cause changes that are natural in rates and natural in kind, then they're likely to be benign. If they're neither natural in rate or kind, then we should be concerned about them. So the problem, for example, with global warming is not that there might be a change in temperature, but it's the rate at which the temperature will change. The climatologists who make projections using big computer simulations say that the climate will warm faster than it ever has as long as people have been on the earth, and so fast that the climate will essentially move out from under forests and grasslands. And so it's the rate of change with global warming that's the problem. And you can look at natural rates of climate change and say if we could keep the rate of change within that natural rate, then things would be all right. Now that's actually an encouraging way to view these things, because that means the problem of global warming is not all or nothing. If you can do anything to slow down the rate of change and get it closer to a natural rate, then maybe what seems to be disastrous will be less so. So this approach I'm suggesting can actually make things seem better and help us solve these problems. Now, again, you can ask what is an unnatural change? Introducing novel chemical elements into the environment, as I understand you're having problems with here in Iowa with pesticides in the groundwater and in water supply. That's the kind of thing to be concerned about, because the novel chemicals are not things that life has had a chance over a very long period to adjust to. So you begin to have a way to judge good from bad, and you don't get locked into contradictory and impossible arguments. Okay, now the points I've been trying to make is that in the attempts to manage the environment in the 20th century, as in the case of Aldo Leopold and the Kaibab deer, statements and policy were put forward as if they had a scientific basis, where in fact they're based on an ancient mythology. And this mythology turns out to be inconsistent with what we know from modern scientific studies to be with the true characteristic of nature, of populations, and of natural ecological systems. And the more we try to cling to those myths, the more trouble we'll get into in trying to solve our environmental problems. What we have to do is to become very rational and objective and look at the true dynamics of these natural systems, and then from that we can begin to find ways to deal with our environmental problems. Thank you very much.